Our topic tonight, as you know, is Trade Trifecta in 2015, question mark. And we're looking at a set of trade agreements which the President is strongly, eagerly hoping for approval. The Trans-Pacific arrangements and the transatlantic arrangements with the Eurozone. And then, of course, fast-track authority in both cases. And, as you know, Representative Ryan, Republican head of the Appropriations Committee, is strongly in favor of these kind of things as well. And so it may well be an opportunity for the country to move with some coherence and agreement. But tonight we couldn't have anyone, I think, much better to talk about the topic. This is one of the nation's outstanding authorities on the questions of international trade and business. Dr. Hufbauer is a graduate of Harvard. He's his PhD is from King College, Cambridge University, in Great Britain. He also holds a Doctor of Jurisprudence from Georgetown University. He was in the Department of the Treasury for a period of time. The second of the jobs he had there was as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Trade and Investment. He then spent a long period of time at Georgetown, the institution in which he, as I say, had received his law degree. He worked in their Law Institute, first as a deputy director, then as a research scholar, and then was appointed as a professor, the Wallenberg Professor of International Trade and Investment. He was there until, I think, 1982, if I remember correctly, and from there went to the Peterson, 92 rather, went to the Peterson Institute in Washington, which is one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. I should have mentioned that, and that was interrupted only for a period of time, 96 to 98, when he was at the Council on Foreign Relations as director of their studies program. And he's continued at the Peterson Institute until today, his present position, where he's a senior fellow. His publications are numerous. I won't take up the next half hour going through them, but they are numerous. They cover almost every facet of trade considerations and a number of very interesting policy questions. The New York Times on the front page, of course, had a subheadline about disagreements with China, and we're going to take them to the World Trade Organization. Well, he's written about that particular issue, our disputes with China. He also has written on the subsidy question, which, of course, appears to be one of the major disputes that we're having at the moment. He's written on the argument of encouraging normalization of trade with Russia. He's laid out a roadmap for normalization of trade with Cuba. Built all around this, as I say, are almost every facet of an interesting question in international trade. So in short, we're fortunate to have a most distinguished and accomplished guest this evening, Professor Hufbauer.
Well, Frank, thank you very much for that overly generous introduction, and also thanks to Anonymous for the wine. And there are several glasses outside, so please have one before you leave. You may need one after I speak. Now, this is really a critical year for trade policy because, as Frank said, President Obama, who is really does not have a history or a record of enthusiasm for international trade agreements or for foreign investment by U.S. firms, has stepped up to the plate in a major way, and I think has committed himself to getting the authority to negotiate, to conclude these agreements. And I've been asked, why is he doing this? Well, I think the main reason is legacy. This will be a major accomplishment of his second term if he achieves it, and that would be quite important, and I think he probably looks back to President Clinton, who achieved really notable things in the trade area during his presidency. So that would be my explanation for this, I would say, somewhat of a turn of ideological preference by President Obama. I think a second reason, which is quite important, personalities matter, and he's very close to Ambassador Froman. They were college classmates together, and I've been told that when Michael Froman, took over the position of being U.S. Trade Representative from Ron Kirk, that he said he would only do it if President Obama would support him all the way and had his back. That seems to be what happened. So that's my explanation of why we're at this juncture, but it's a very important juncture. If we look at the last 20 years, we have not had what I would call major policy liberalization of trade or investment, and they are very closely tied together for a long time, since the Uruguay round was concluded in 1994, and that's a long period of time. And the consequences of that policy, what I would call policy neglect, is that if you look at the growth of trade relative to the growth of world gross domestic product, it has slowed dramatically. For most of my professional career, we could count on trade growing 2 to 4 percentage points faster per year than world gross domestic product. And it was an engine of gross domestic product growth around the world. And the last 50 years, the data is very, very strong. Those are the best 50 years between the end of the Second World War and say 2000 were the best 50 years in recorded economic history. It was a very good period, and the rapid growth of trade was part of that. The other part of it was the rapid growth of direct investment, where there's control by the corporation of the activities abroad. And that just grew even more spectacularly fast than trade. However, trade no longer grows faster than GDP, and that's been true for about 7 years now, 7 or 8 years. And direct investment, well, the stock is very large. The flow has slowed down sharply. In 2007, it was 2.1 trillion for the world as a whole. And last year, 2014, it was 1.3 trillion. So that's a pretty big drop, and that's been kind of happening. So I attribute this slowdown of what I would call this globalization phenomenon as measured in trade and investment to the fact that there's not been much new policy liberalization. Yes, we've had an agreement with Korea, with Colombia, with other countries, but those are fairly small compared to the overall world economy. So that, to me, is a regrettable backdrop because, well, it means that, maybe people in the United States don't notice it. There are a lot of people around the world who, I don't know if they know the cause, but the slowing world growth means that poor people in countries like Africa and parts of Latin America and Central Asia will stay poorer much longer than they would if growth were faster. And we have evidence from the countries which have integrated in the world economy, Colombia, Chile, Korea, Malaysia, a whole host of countries have come in, but there are a lot of countries which haven't, and they will be the ones who principally lose if we have a turning around of this policy initiative. Now, I mentioned why I think President Obama has taken on this fight, and it will be a fight. It's a major fight. I think it will be as hard a fight as he had for the health care in terms of getting the votes. And it's a difficult time because the public opinion polls done by Pew, the Pew Foundation, show there's a widespread skepticism of trade, widespread skepticism of investment by foreign firms, particularly if it involves mergers and acquisitions. When I say widespread, I don't mean only in the United States, I mean in Europe as well, and many other countries, Japan. There are some countries which are enthusiastic. China is one of them for, I think, obvious reasons. Mexico is another for, I think, also obvious reasons. So we have a lot of skepticism, and that skepticism, I think, is rooted in the fact that in this country, it's rooted in the fact that median wages have been pretty flat. They haven't been zero, which is what is said in the papers, but it's been about 0.5% to 1% growth per year, which is much slower than it has been in the past if we take compensation, wages plus fringes. And you know the story in Europe, which is worse than here because there's very, very high unemployment in Europe, and Japan has a lot of disguised unemployment and so forth. So, there's not a lot of enthusiasm. And when you look at the analytics of it, what trade liberalization really does is increase the supply side of the world economy because it makes us all much more efficient. And the evidence for that is overwhelming, that trade drives efficiency. It forces management to, pull up its boots or whatever metaphor you want to use. But in addition, so much of the world economy depends on knowledge. It's not machinery in the physical sense, it's knowledge of how you run major enterprises. Everything from, obviously Apple is a great example, but there are many other great examples, any pharmaceutical company, any financial company and so forth. It's the knowledge of it, and if you can get that knowledge once and apply it over the world economy, that really reduces the cost a lot. If countries have to reinvent this knowledge, or they have economic systems that force reinvention, well, that's a big loss of efficiency. So it's a supply side phenomenon principally, and here we have a world economy which in most places has a shortage of demand. In the US, we're doing pretty well, not great, but pretty well, and most other places are not doing pretty well, and unemployment is very high, and it's struggling along at a very modest growth rate in the world, and so that's not a great time for pushing these in terms of being up against the supply side constraint. But for a variety of reasons, we've come to this juncture in policy. Now, I think besides the second term vacuum, or legacy vacuum which is being filled by trade policy, the other big reason is that the world leaders, what else are they going to do to stimulate the world economy or to try to get things going or to show that they're doing something? Well, we have the most liberal monetary policy, again, in human history. There's been no time, as far as we know, when interest rates have been negative. Not deeply negative, but in nominal terms. I don't mean just in real terms. We've had negative real interest rates often in the past, in inflationary periods. But now Nestle sold bonds at negative interest rates, corporate bonds, and the Swiss central bank charges private banks, a fee for having deposits with the Swiss central bank. This is just remarkable. So monetary policy has really been pushed pretty far. It's hard to imagine a stronger push. And fiscal policy is pretty constrained, I think wrongly so, but politically, most countries feel that they can't take on any more debt without burdening their present and future populations. So that kind of leaves what else can we do? Well, trade policy is one of those things. Now, in the United States, this comes to a crunch in terms of trade promotion authority, which the old label for that was fast track, which really does just two things. It commits the Congress to vote on a trade agreement within a defined period of time, normally 90 days from the time the president submits it. And it commits the Congress to have an up or down vote on the whole package. That's what it does. And then, in addition, the Congress gives the president lots of instructions and so forth in Trade Promotion Authority as to what ought to be in and what shouldn't be in it, and that's most of the text. But the two critical things are what I just mentioned. And that's the first battle. Senator Hatch and Congressman Ryan have said they're going to come up with a draft of Trade Promotion Authority this month. Well, and of course the forces are lining up. Those who oppose it and those in for it are waging the battle as we speak, and this will be a tough vote. I'm not a lobbyist or congressional watcher to a high extent, but my guess is that with great effort, President Obama will be able to get 20 House Democrats to vote in favor. And that on the Republican side, that 30 or so, maybe as many as 40 Republicans will not vote for it for a combination of reasons. One, they don't like anything that Obama does. Secondly, they don't want to give more authority to this president or any other president, so they regard it as an invasion. Then thirdly, there may be interest in their own communities, congressional districts, which really don't want to liberalize trade because they're going to face competition from some foreign supplier. So if you lose 40 on the Republican side, gain 20 on the Democrat side, you just have barely enough votes to pass it in the House. In the Senate, it's not a question it will pass, I think almost without doubt, but the House is the key point. So that's my prediction, and may be wrong. We think it's going to pass, that Trade Promotion Authority is going to pass by April or May. If it doesn't pass, then nothing more is going to happen. That's it. That would be a big no by the United States against further trade and investment liberalization. Now, if it passes, then apart from those 2 points I mentioned, there are a number of interesting things to watch being in the bill or not, being in the law that goes up to the president to sign. The first thing, which has really crystallized even since I started preparing for this event tonight, is the currency issue. And the way it has crystallized is that there seemed to be a majority in both the House and the Senate to call other countries currency manipulators. That's a term of art. If they intervene heavily in their foreign exchange markets by buying dollars or euros, and then a couple of other conditions in terms of the size of their foreign exchange reserves and the change in their foreign exchange reserves. If a country is designated a manipulator, then the United States, in a so-called countervailing duty case where the allegation is that the foreign good has been subsidized and therefore will be subject to a penalty duty, the extent of manipulation will be part of that subsidy, will be counted. So if it's a 5% manipulation, 10%, whatever, that will be added on to whatever other subsidy might be found. That's the proposal that's going forward. And there's very similar bills in both the House and the Senate. And leaders, or not leaders, but members in both houses have said the president has to sign this or they will not support Trade Promotion Authority. So that looks like being part of what I would call the overall package, though it won't be actually part of Trade Promotion Authority, but a separate bill. If there are questions on that, I could answer them. And this has a very dodgy future, but it's a political answer to a widespread complaint that foreign countries undervalue their currencies and therefore get an export advantage to the United States. It's a widespread complaint, and this is the political answer to it. Now, apart from that companion bill, there are a couple of other points which will be interesting to watch coming up in the Trade Promotion Authority, assuming it passes. Will the United States give or deny the president authority to liberalize what I call the sacred cows of the U.S., of our economic establishment? So what are some of them? Well, the oldest and longest duration sacred cow is the maritime industry, the so-called Jones Act, which dates from 1921, but actually the history of this dates back to the beginning of the Republic. We protect maritime extensively, and basically we don't allow a shipment from Baltimore to be picked up by a foreign vessel and taken to wherever, Roanoke or any other U.S. port. That's the Jones Act, and it's a pretty strong piece of legislation. It's been there forever. And the same, and that's called, and it's protecting so-called cabotage. And the same principle applies to airlines, which is just as important economically, or maybe even more important. So that a foreign carrier, let's say Turkish Airlines, which has flights to New York regularly, and then has flights to Chicago, but if it brings a flight to New York, it cannot pick up U.S. passengers and take them to Chicago. So that's also part. I don't think either of those is going to be liberalized. Or I don't think the permission will be given to the president to liberalize that. Either it will be knocked out in the legislation, or the administration will give commitments that won't liberalize. What else? Well, the other really big area is government procurement. Now, governments buy a lot of stuff. In fact, government procurement in the United States, if we take state, local, and federal altogether, amounts to about 15 to maybe 18% of our economy. Now, there's a lot of else in government, which is the civil servants, and so the total government expenditures in the 30% range, 35% range. But 15% is procurement from private firms. We have liberalized some government procurement in the World Trade Organization, but we haven't liberalized it all, and we haven't liberalized it with our with the partners in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is up for debate now. To all of them, some of them yes, because to the World Trade Organization. That's a sensitive issue, and it's not only goods, actual stuff you can touch and feel, but it's services. Government buys a lot of services. We all know it has had contract military. That's not at issue. Nobody's thinking about liberalizing, intelligence, military, but it buys a lot of other services which are far removed from the Defense Department or the CIA, and those are not open to foreign suppliers at this time. So the question is whether they will be open. Now, even more sensitive than that, and on that, let me just say that there was a resolution, it doesn't have binding effect, but a resolution passed by the House last year which said don't open government procurement. The other part of government procurement, which is very big, which is basically not open on a legislative basis, is state and local. Some states, by their own discretion, open their procurement to foreign firms, both of goods and services, but it's very spotty, and it's certainly not general practice. I don't think that will be opened either, but I might be wrong. Then what else? Well, we have some very sensitive industries which have managed to hold on to their protection for, well, since the Great Depression, so that's a long time now, not quite 100 years, but running on. Sugar is number one, and probably will not be liberalized, and parts of the dairy industry are number two. Cheese in particular, we have very strict quotas on cheese. So those are some of the issues that will be battled over and are being battled over right now by the lobbyists and in the administration. And obviously, the more the U.S. cuts back on what it will liberalize, other countries will pull back on what they will liberalize, and we definitely want the Japanese and the Canadians to liberalize their agriculture. There are a few other issues, but I would say the other one I would call out on this as this TPA debate heats up is what will Hillary Clinton say and what will Elizabeth Warren say? Because they both have very powerful voices within the Democratic Party and how they see it. I'm expecting Warren to come out in outright opposition, and she has a lot of followers. I don't know. I think Clinton will nuance her approach. I'm sure she's deliberating it now. I will be pleasantly surprised if she, you know where I'm coming from, if she completely supports Obama, but I'm not expecting it. Now, that's that's on the Trans-Pacific part, on the the Trade Promotion Authority, which is the gate to which all these agreements will come if they do come. What about the Trans-Pacific Partnership? I mean, this is a massive agreement. It covers a lot more than tariffs and quotas, which were the subject matter of agreements when I started my career, but that's long ago. And now trade agreements cover a lot more, and they cover behind the border stuff. So let me just tick off some of the things that will be important in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we don't know yet because the text is fairly closely held. Now that's another important issue, and the opponents complain that, you know, the text is not completely open and, you know, it's negotiating in the dark and so forth. And my answer to that is I don't see how you do a negotiation if every time you change the draft, it becomes public knowledge. It just makes it very, very difficult. And that's not how Congress writes bills. That's not how the Supreme Court decides its decisions. They don't tell us all what the alternative views were, except as they appear in the opinions, and so on. So there's a lot of deliberation that goes on, which is not in the public eye, but opponents of trade agreements are very bitter about this and complain. And say, I think false opponents there would be the some congressmen who complain, because I know that the Congress is very closely briefed on this, particularly the leaders. So I think they have less complaint, but people who are outside the congressional circuit, you know, they may have a complaint. Now, having said that, just following the press and so forth, here are some of the issues which we'll see how they come out. First is just how fast will tariffs go down and quotas. For example, we have a cheese quota. Only a certain tonnage of cheese can come in. And New Zealand and Australia would like us to have more tonnage, right? How fast will those be liberalized? And the negotiator's trick on this for a very sensitive industry is to take a long time to liberalize. And with Australia, we, that is the United States, insisted on 18 years to liberalize imports of beef from Australia. That was kind of a record when that agreement was reached. But now in the TPP, the talk is 25 years. I mean, it's a generation. Well, I guess it's a generation. So for the most difficult issues. So that phase-out period, that's what's being battled over kind of behind the scenes. And you can imagine that agricultural liberalization in Japan will probably have a very long phase-out period. But on our side, auto liberalization will be the auto industry is insisting on a very long phase-out. And they have one tariff which covers all the SUVs at 25%. It has a very interesting historical background, but it's a very high tariff, and that will be phased out over a very long period. So that's one issue. Government procurement, I've talked about that. How much will countries open their government procurement? Another issue. Another issue, which has been much in the press lately, is the extent of intellectual property protection in these agreements. And there are many voices, including Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, who oppose intellectual property protection. I'm on the other side of that question because for two reasons. One is a nationalistic reason. If you take U.S. industry, a huge portion of the value of most companies is intellectual property, by which I mean trade secrets as well as patents and copyrights and trademarks, the whole. And that's at least half the value of the U.S. stock exchange, at least. For a company like Apple, it's like 85%. So this is a very big part, that's my nationalist thing. I mean, it's a very big part of what the U.S. has contributed, and we've all paid for it, but what we pay for the products we buy. So that's one part of my answer. The second part is that I think where we are able to do the econometrics on it, which is not very many areas, that intellectual property protection has a tremendous payoff in terms of stimulating innovation relative to the monopoly cost that the company gets. And in pharmaceuticals, this is most apparent. The evidence on pharmaceuticals is that our pharmaceuticals are a big contributor to the longer lifespan of Americans, a big contributor. And you can just take the value of American lives, because we have all sorts of statistics on that, and attribute a certain amount to pharmaceuticals, and that value is hugely greater than the monopoly value that the monopoly rights that we give to pharmaceutical and biological companies. That's my argument on that. So I'm in favor of it, but other people take a different view, and they don't like this patent protection being carried over and being forced on other countries, which is part of the big debate in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Another area of debate that we'll see when the text comes out is rules for state-owned enterprises. Now, we all have state-owned enterprises. Amtrak, that's state-owned, for sure. We have Uranium Enrichment Company, which is state-owned. We have the Tennessee Valley Authority, that's state-owned. In addition, all our pension funds, well, not all, but all state pension funds, CalPERS, and I'm sure Maryland has one and New York has one, those are state-owned firms. Now, what are the rules? Usually when we think about state-owned enterprise, we're thinking about the Chinese or China is not part of Trans-Pacific Partnership, but we're thinking about them, and Vietnam, which has steel firms and whatever. But we have them too. So what are the rules for these? And there are two aspects of those rules. One, this procurement issue, which I go back to. Now, CalPERS, I'll just take CalPERS. CalPERS hires people, outside CalPERS who are investment advisors. And they get good fees, and there's been even some corruption associated with that. We won't go into that. But what they don't do is hire foreigners. Well, that's an issue right there. And what about Amtrak? It probably hires consultants as well. I know it buys foreign trains, and so that doesn't seem to be an issue, but they do, consultants and so forth. And you go right through. So any rules that, they go to this procurement issue, but they also go to the issue of how this state-owned firm competes domestically against foreign firms which produce the same thing and internationally. So that's a big area, and this is a completely novel area for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is not in other, well, it is in the Singapore agreement, U.S. agreement with Singapore, but that's a very small country. Okay, and another issue is how investor-state disputes get settled, and I'll go into that if there are any questions. So those are big issues. I think we'll see the text by June, and we'll all be able to see it and be unfolded, and there'll be a huge debate as to what it does. Now, I know how the debate will go because it go just like the debates on prior trade agreements. It will be the opponents will say this is going to lose jobs, and the proponents will say it's going to gain jobs. And I say both of those are nonsense statements. The result of a trade agreement is not to either, in an aggregate sense, to increase employment very much or decrease employment very much. It shuffles jobs between sectors of the economy to less efficient to more efficient sectors. But the net effect on jobs will be very small. But having said that, you'll see all sorts of statements or claims about how it's going to kill these jobs or those jobs. It will certainly kill certain jobs. There will be losers, but there will also be gainers. The statements I object to is when they say net, there's going to be a net huge gain or net huge loss. If people would say, well, certain industries, I'll take one, which will certainly be in the U.S. a loser. The garment industry. We protect garments, everything we wear. We have moderately high tariffs on them, and those will come down as part of this deal if the deal comes through, because that's what Vietnam is getting out of it. And Vietnam is a garment-producing country. So there will be some adverse impact in that industry, but there'll be other industries in the U.S. which will gain terrifically. And I'm not saying that garment workers can go to work at Morgan Stanley. I don't make that claim. There is an adjustment burden. And whether the Trans-Pacific Partnership and TPA has any adjustment assistance, that's another debate that I should have mentioned. Okay, let me turn quickly to the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I'll be more brief here because I don't think this is going to happen. We had this title that I talked with Frank about, Trade Trifecta. Well, I don't think the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is actually would be quite important for Maryland, being an Atlantic state and very close to Europe in many ways, is going to go through in this administration. I think it will set the table for it, and the next administration will probably pick it up. Why don't I think it will go through? Because it is a big step beyond what the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks about. Trans-Pacific Partnership talks about what I would say pretty obvious barriers to trade and some barriers to investment. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the core of that, or the hoped-for core, is regulatory harmonization or convergence. Europe has its regulators, we have our regulators, and we have them at the federal level and the state level. And most regulators who are in their particular industry, they think they have a direct channel to God. And he has spoken to them and told them how you balance this delicate business between consumer safety, product safety, and efficiency, and what works for the industry. And they come up to a certain set of regulations which it tries to achieve that in electrical, in autos, and pharmaceuticals, and so forth. And these regulators are not accustomed to listening to regulators in another country. And that's what this is talking about, and somehow getting the same regulation. And that's, I think it can happen, but we've had many tries. And just to show you how difficult it is, I'll go back again to the pharmaceutical industry. Well, let me start with autos. You know, it's basically the same firms which produce autos in Europe and here, and it's not very many firms. You would think we would have the same safety regulations for airbags, for bumpers, for the glass and the windshield and so forth, roll bars. We do not. And those regulatory differences are enough that you can't take an auto from Europe and sell it here, or an auto from here and sell it in Europe. You have to modify it, and that's very expensive, and that doesn't happen. So basically, we're producing in both countries and losing the efficiency from that. And we have had 3 tries in the past 20 years to have auto harmonization with Europe, and they've all fallen down because of these differences between the transportation department here and equivalent bodies in Europe. So there's one where I think it will happen, but I think that's beyond that. It's more difficult. Let me go quickly to pharmaceuticals. To create a new drug, it's about $1 billion. It costs about $1 billion for a genuinely new compound. And most of that, well, you know, it depends on the drug and so forth. A good part of that is in the research, but the bigger part is in the testing of the product. And there are 3 phases of tests. I won't go into that, but they are all very expensive. And now, are we going to accept European testing, you know, to a prison population or a more general population of drugs? No. Are they going to accept our testing? No. So we do the test twice. But the one area where we seem to be almost on the verge of getting cooperation is that the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, has agreed to go to Europe and see which firms are manufacturing drugs to our standards of, safety and, cleanliness and so forth and so on. So that just shows it's making progress, but slow progress. So that's a reason I'm a little skeptical on TTIP. I could go into other reasons as well. But I think it might go forward in the next administration if we set a basis in this administration. The one thing it has going for it is that I don't think you get labor opposition in this country to an agreement with Europe, because the labor standards are about the same, and if not higher in Europe. And so we don't have the ideological opposition that will be very strong in the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So briefly, last but not least, I was just in Istanbul on a meeting on the World Trade Organization. This is an organization which is kind of on life support because it doesn't function very well in the 21st century. In order to make a decision, it takes unanimity, and that is very difficult. It was not difficult in yesteryear when I started my career when, 4 countries could really decide and the others would come along. But those days are over now. So you have to get many more countries to agree, and theoretically you have to get unanimous, and that's very hard to do. And then you try to do these big packages like the Doha round, and that didn't go. So it needs a new mode of operation, but I guess the question is whether anything will be done. And the one thing that might be done during the Obama administration is this Trade and Services Agreement, TISA, Trade and Services Agreement, which would be a real breakthrough. If you look at the barriers to services trade, which is most of our economy is services, the barriers to services trade, when expressed as tariff equivalent barriers, start at about 30%, which is far higher than goods, and go up to 100% or more, or just complete prohibition on services. So there's a lot of room for services trade, particularly with all the digital technology we now have, where the Trade and Services Agreement might make a difference. And that's being done not quite within the World Trade Organization, but kind of in the next room over, and it looks like it might achieve. Well, let me just wrap up by talking a little bit about failure and success. I think it is certainly conceivable that this effort will fail. What we're talking about now, the Trade Promotion Authority, and then that's very closely linked to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that though they could go down. My prediction is they will not, but if they did, I think that would bring to an end about a half century of policy liberalization that we've seen since the Second World War. And things would go quite slowly after this. I think if that happened, the big cost will be paid by developing countries or less developed countries that will not be able to access markets to the extent they might otherwise do. And I think globally we'll lose about 0.5% per year of growth. So we don't lose everything, but we lose something. We've had very good growth for this long period of time. As I said, it was a terrific period between 1950 and 2000. And we would lose some of that, so that would be too bad. And if we succeed in this, I think that you get the reverse of all the above, which would be is a much more pleasant outlook for the future. Thank you very much.
Well, we thank you. That was extraordinarily clear, helpful. The floor is open for questions. What is labor's reaction to these agreements is the primary question.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
then what benefits might accrue to the middle class?
Okay. Labor's reaction will be negative. It doesn't matter how these agreements are tweaked or twitched or whatever. or currency provision, trade adjustment assistance, which I didn't talk about but has been part and probably will be part of it, that will not change labor's position. Labor will be opposed, almost certainly. Even though, and here's the interesting thing, even though by far the dominant portion of union membership today is state and local government, which is not affected by this, and for the reasons I've said, and it's just not a traded service at this point. But that doesn't matter. Labor will definitely oppose. Now, what about, but the organized labor is about, I think now about 11% or less of the total labor force. So there are a lot of people in the middle class who are not members of organized labor, and how will they benefit? Well, I would certainly agree that we've had this break between productivity growth and wage growth for most of my career, and ever since it really, the statistics, good statistics go back to about the 20s. There was a long period of time when productivity and wage growth were lockstep, and that's what we were taught. And in graduate school, anybody who took economics, you kind of saw this. It was one of those great laws. Productivity goes up 2%, wages go up 2%. That has not happened in the last decade. We've had this break. And the break, I think, can be explained by how technology has developed, particularly digital technology in the last decade. I think you can, if you want to blame one person or two people, it's Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Though they're great people, but if you want to talk about this break, it's not trade policy, because we had liberalization before and we didn't have the break. Now we have the break. So what are the benefits to the middle class given this situation? Well, I think the main benefits, come up on the purchasing side in Target, autos, whatever, and you compare cost to consumers of a whole range of middle class products here and in countries which are less open to trade, and our costs are generally, quite low. They're quite low compared to Europe. They're quite low compared to Australia and the countries I've been in. Just U.S. is a very reasonable place to buy all sorts of goods, including, Mr. Anonymous, the wine here. Wine, I was just in China. You get this lousy wine for, $30 a bottle. And
That's the wine in China he's talking about.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the benefits. But I think there's a separate problem on the middle class wages in this country, a very severe problem. And I think if we have another decade like the past decade, I think it'll be, if it's not already the central political problem, it will be the central political problem.
Are the trade agreements to the benefit of people in other countries and not here in the United States?
Okay, well, since you want to stay for another 4 hours, I will. We did a long study, and it's not been refuted, in my view, by any of the professional commentators, which went through tried to estimate the benefits to the average American household of both trade liberalization and the technology which has enabled much greater trade, which, container ships, you want to think about that, and internet and so forth, over the last 50 years. And we concluded, and I thought it was quite a reasonable estimate, that for the average American household, the benefit today is about $5,000 from this package, which is certainly quite favorable compared to what government can do for you in other ways. I mean, it's pretty good payoff for government. It's not trivial. That's a household of 3 persons, which is not quite the statistical household. Now we're probably a little less than 3. But anyway, for 3-person household, $5,000, and that compares to, probably a household average median income now is someplace in the 65,000. I should say compensation, I'm including fringes as well, 65, 70,000 for the median at this point in time. So, it's not trivial, but it's not, more than half. Now, and that's why just looking at it selfishly, that's why Congress should do it. I think we could get comparable benefits. We estimate in saying the same set of exercises that there's another 5,000 which would be out there if we had free trade in the world. I mean, that's a big if. But, we're not all the way there for the reasons I just talked about. Barriers abroad, barriers here, and we could get a lot more efficient. So that's a big payoff for the United States. Now, percentage-wise, what you say for developing countries is true. Those developing countries that choose to participate, which is not all developing countries, but those that have chosen to participate in a big way, they probably get a bigger percentage than what I have said. But does Congress care about that? No, it does not. That's not what Congress cares about. But there's a very strong self-interest in this country to do it.
I think there are two questions.
Right.
Yeah, well, they're related because they're
Right,
intellectual.
right, right.
One is on evergreening. The central theme is intellectual property.
Right.
Right.
Would you
And-
comment on it, please?
And the length of protection, I understand, if I'm understanding what your use of the term evergreening, it's a matter of having a slight variation which leads to a new
That's
patent.
exactly what evergreen means.
Right. And then the copyright, I believe our current copyright law is the life of the creator plus 75 years. Well, so it could be 150 years might be a bit long, but anyway, it's
It depends, if you can't identify when the person died, it's 150.
yeah, okay, well, yes, okay. So we do have potentially very long. Now, I think there's quite a legitimate question on the two issues that you mentioned. That is the patent variation, which then extends to slightly changed product, and the length of copyright. And I don't say in general that the U.S. has reached the nirvana on either one. There's a second issue or an underlying issue on the patent side, and that is whether, as a kind of a moral proposition, patented products, particularly pharmaceuticals, but maybe fertilizers as well and so forth, should be made available to people in poor countries. They should just be license free, basically, or they should be able to produce generics free. And that's a moral issue, and obviously a lot of people think that India or another poor country, Vietnam or whatever, should be able to avail itself of generics without a patent. On that, that's a legitimate, I think, a reasonable area of dispute. It has not been settled in the WTO. It's kind of a suspended.
Sorry, Indian pharmaceutical industry is a major world pharmaceutical industry, and we're talking about selling drugs in the world market and whether or not evergreening. We're not talking about Uganda where the drugs are.
Yeah, okay, well, you've now raised a third issue, which is the export of the generically produced products. I mean, all these are legitimate issues for debate. I don't think they come up very intensively either in the TPP, with maybe one exception, which would be Vietnam, which is the one really poor country in the TPP, and certainly not in TTIP, which is basically wealthy countries. I don't think the U.S. is pressing other countries to adopt its copyright, our very long copyright statute. I don't know how many countries have adopted anything similar to that, but it is exceptionally long, and it was put in, I believe, by Disney. They got it across. But I don't think the U.S. is pressing on that. On the big issues in the TPP are data exclusivity for the marketing purpose, and then the ability to tack on the marketing review process to the patent period, which is a more limited issue. So the big questions you've raised, I don't think are coming up in the TPP agreement, nor do I think they'll come up in TTIP. But there's certainly big issues in the whole world framework of intellectual property, which is, not really under discussion presently.
Would you like to deal with the environmental issues that will arise?
Actually, I should have mentioned that at the beginning. I think we can safely predict that the Sierra Club will oppose this agreement because they've opposed every other trade agreement in recent times. But National Wildlife probably will not, and several other environmental groups will not. There'll probably be a division between the environmental groups. However, from the standpoint of environmental groups, the TPP will make a pretty big advance, because what it's going to do, I'm told, is make it much easier to bring disputes on environmental practices which are inconsistent with the country's own obligations than prior trade agreements have done. The dispute settlement system will be the same as it would be if you put a barrier on goods which you had agreed not to put on a country. So that's a big breakthrough. If you look at prior trade agreements, the dispute settlement for environmental issues was essentially a consultative system, not an arbitration. This will be an arbitration system. That's a pretty big step. Now, what it will not do, and I want to be very clear on this, there is no agreed standard for environmental practices, and that is not being hammered out in the TPP. In the TTIP, it might be. That's more likely with Europe, but not in the TPP, which means that countries they choose their own standard, and they're required to adhere to their standard. And many countries have, have good standards, but not in every respect. And it will not do anything about emissions, because most countries have no kind of global emission standard or whatever. I mean, they're putting it in piecemeal, but there'll be no generalized emission standard in TPP. So, it's not going to go all the way, but this dispute settlement is a big thing. And I want to contrast that with labor. In labor, there is now an agreed template which came about as a result of, I would give Congressman Levin a lot of credit for this, the Democrat from Michigan, and others as well. The ILO has this concept of fundamental principles of rights at work. And there are 5 of them, and they're very short. It's, and you can Google them, and it's less than a page. But countries in the TPP will all agree to adhere to those, as we did, as Peru did, and other countries, and as the U.S. did. Now, how those will be interpreted remains to be seen. They're kind of constitutional level principles. You have to be able to unionize, and you shouldn't discriminate in employment. But we don't have that same template of agreed principles in environment, and we're a long way from getting there. Thank you.